one of the things that we're hearing is that China may have plateaued. It may have reached its pinnacle and may not be able for a whole variety of reasons. And I think there are some important lessons that we can take in what has happened in the last year with Russia, how authoritarian regimes do have some intrinsic challenges that make it difficult in this very competitive, in this very complex world for them to grow.
The world of late, as the great Bob Marley said. He said there's so much trouble in the world, didn't he? And there really is. Just listen to the news. Just listen to the things we talk about on a daily basis. Tonight, a man who can help shed some light on what's really happening and what can be done about it. Brett Bruen was the director of global engagement at the White House between 2013 and 2015, working alongside Barack Obama. He was in charge of crisis management strategies, including tackling Russian propaganda and the kidnap of 200 girls in Nigeria. He's also worked on the front line of crises in the Ivory Coast, Venezuela, Iraq, and Madagascar. These days, Brett is a president of the public affairs agency Global Situation Room, something of an international diplomat at large. And he hosts a podcast, One Decision, where he interviews world leaders and considers the decisions that he makes. That they make, excuse me. Brett has been very generous with his time and joins us for a bit tonight on Times Radio to talk through a whole magnitude of issues. Brett, hello, good evening.
And good evening. How are you?
Oh, I'm really, really well. Thank you for being with us. And welcome to London as well, and welcome to the UK.
I wish we had a bit warmer weather, but it's quite festive.
Yes, we can't promise that. But it does look like a picture postcard, doesn't it? It does look like something from a Dickens novel at the moment. So at least we put that on for you, Brett. So you got the full English experience. Do you spend I guess you spend a lot of time at the moment, as I said, a sort of diplomat at large, traveling around the world.
I do. And, it's interesting when I talk to my former colleagues at American embassies around the world, share that much of the work that we're doing now is not dissimilar from the kind of public diplomacy that I practiced when I was a spokesperson at embassies overseas. Ultimately, you're trying to help clients, companies, and organizations to navigate the risks and the reputational threats that are out there, whether they're political, social, economic. And it seems as though And yet, at every moment that we were extending that off ramp, he would just accelerate faster and farther down the highway. And what these authoritarian leaders understand is pressure. And so it's important that we sustain that pressure. And I would also say, it's interesting with the case of the execution of the Iranian protester earlier this week, that yes, Brussels, Washington slapped on a few more sanctions, put out a strongly worded statement, but those aren't things that really change the calculus of leaders like Xi Jinping.
Interesting. On that point, then, let's look ahead to next year in Ukraine. February will mark 12 months. It's just a few weeks away, that really, isn't it? How will this war look a year on?
I'm afraid that it's going to look not too dissimilar to what we see at the moment. And we have the experience of what transpired from 2014 up until 2022. And Russia ultimately benefits in that scenario because they're able to use the instability generated by their foothold in eastern Ukraine and in Crimea to create instability, both in Ukraine proper, but also across the NATO alliance. It distracts us from some of the other things that are happening. And, they have this formula. And one area that I think we have to be focused on is what's taking place in Transnistria and in Moldova, where Russia also has a foothold, has taken territory, as well as South Ossetia and Abkhazia and Georgia. Because if I'm Vladimir Putin and I'm looking at how do I come up with an alternative to just continuing to bombard Ukraine, it is testing the NATO alliance in places like Georgia and Moldova and saying, okay, are you really going to give all of that same military support to these countries? And quite frankly, I'm not sure that we would.
Interesting. I'm also keen to hear your take on global leadership through the prism of having spoken to lots of very big names on the One Decision podcast. What do you make of the current crop of global leaders?
It gets back to what I was saying about Rishi Sunak. I think we have an extraordinary deficit in leadership. You have a lot of politicians who put their thumb up to the sky and make decisions based on what, their pollsters, their advisors, the newspapers or radio happen to be saying. And they do not spend enough time offering that strong and quite frankly, inspirational vision of what we could be and where we should be going. I mean, you think back to John F. Kennedy, who laid out a vision of putting a man on the moon by the end of the decade, or for that matter, Ronald Reagan, who stood at the Berlin Wall and called on the Soviets to tear down that barrier. That's the kind of leadership that in these moments of crisis, I think we do need. What I'm hopeful of is we are starting to see, and Rishi Sunak is an example of it, I would say also in the United States, Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, just stood down and gave way to a younger leader for the Democrats in the House of Representatives, Hakeem Jeffries. He's a black congressman from New York. I think he represents the next generation. That's where I'm hoping that we will see a more both youthful and hopefully a more visionary kind of leader.
Paul in Oxford says, could you ask Brett if the Biden administration is increasingly willing to supply more sophisticated weapons to Ukraine? I hope America will, he says.
And in fact, just today I saw a report suggesting that we may supply Patriot missiles, which are our most sophisticated system for air defense. I mean, each of them each missile costs $1 million, so it's extraordinarily expensive. But I think it's extraordinarily necessary. And I just have to ask, I mean, we are now some 10 months from when that invasion started. We're well over a year from when Putin was threatening to invade. And why did it take us this long? Why did so many civilians have to die before we came to the conclusion that this was necessary?
Thank you for your message, Paul. And just while we're with Biden and the United States, there is an African summit in Washington. I think it literally kicked off today, didn't it? I think perhaps or yesterday in Washington. A 3-day summit. It's going to focus on some key challenges: climate change, obviously, governance and food security, etc. How do you see the relationship between those Western countries and Africa playing out in 2023?
It's pretty bad. I served, as you mentioned, in several African countries, and I think we've largely neglected the continent. In fact, Biden isn't meeting with any of those 50 heads of state who happen to be in Washington. He has had very limited contact, phone calls or other meetings with leaders from the continent. And yet, and this is my prediction or worry for next year, I think we've spent a lot of time this year hyper-focused on the war in Ukraine, on Xi Jinping and the situation in China, as well as obviously the Middle East. But I fear that next year we are going to see both some of the food crisis challenges, but also security challenges. I mean, after our withdrawal from Afghanistan, some of these extremist groups, including Boko Haram in West Africa, Al-Shabaab in East Africa, have a newfound sense of purpose. Their coffers, their ranks are getting refilled. And I worry with the economic challenges, with the food security challenges, that we may see new efforts. And on top of that, just in the last year, we've seen a number of coups on the continent, and obviously just the overall erosion in democratic principles. It is a worrying situation.
We're running a bit tight on time, and I really want to try and get to this question, Brett, that I've been hoping to get your take on. And you speak to lots of global leaders for this podcast that you do, One Decision. I also think I'm right in thinking that you sort of ask people to assess the decision that global leaders have taken. Is that right?
We do, and we're also fortunate to have Sir Richard Dearlove, the former head of MI6, as our resident analyst on the podcast. And it's always interesting to get his take now that he is retired. And you do an interview with whether it's a current head of state or someone who's just returned back from the front lines of the war in Ukraine, like Clarissa Ward from CNN, and offering the insight of decades of experience reading intelligence cables and working with whether it's Putin or Xi Jinping and others. It is really remarkable to be able to have that complement, because so often we're inundated with information. We're not given the chance to have the analysis to see what it means. And to your point about decision making, I think we underestimate the critical importance of having those skills to be able both to analyze and then to make an informed decision.
We lack those skills, or or the leaders lack those skills, or they lack the time to apply those skills. Where's the problem?
I would say it's both, but I certainly think that it starts at the school level. We're not teaching our children how to make decisions, how to weigh information and determine a path forward. I think in a world that is increasingly complex, in a world where we face so many of these challenges, we have got to equip our children, and certainly I think as we go up through to adulthood and then take on leadership roles, we have to give. And I think there's too much risk avoidance that we're seeing, and so people simply avoid either making a decision or avoid getting into an uncomfortable situation.
Okay. Brett, we're pretty much out of time because we need to talk about Elon Musk next. Before we do, just take us there. What a fascinating character in recent weeks, recent days, recent hours. He's been a fascinating character. What do you make of him?
Well, I'm quite concerned about some of the things he's doing on Twitter and how disinformation is starting to once again get a foothold on Twitter, and his inconsistency on questions about whether accounts can exist that are critical of him. So I think there needs to be more pressure from leaders and from the public in general to say this is just like our airwaves, just like our other utilities. This is a public service and is not up to the whims of a flamboyant billionaire.
Do you think? I mean, given sort of arc of his contribution. Some incredible advancements in electric cars and satellite technology and all that sort of stuff. And then the utter chaos that seems to have been his takeover of Twitter and the way in which he's muddied the waters around that. And he just bizarre contribution to public discourse. Do you think he's a good or bad force?
Well, I think he is somebody who pushes, and as you said, not only on electric vehicles, but obviously in terms of space flight. But that pushing doesn't necessarily work in the same way when it's not an engineering feat, when it is dealing with social issues, when it is dealing with public discourse. And so, having that that extreme pressure to follow one line, I don't think it works in the same way on a social media platform.
Okay, yeah, very interesting. And that kind of links us all to all of those things we've been talking about together tonight, doesn't it, quite nicely? Brett, it's been a real pleasure to have you on the show tonight, and thank you for being generous with your time and your insights and your expertise. The podcast is One Decision. It's really worth listening to with various world leaders, and you sort of assess the decisions and stuff. I hope you enjoy the rest of your time in the UK, Brett. Really nice to talk to you.
Great to speak with you.